Tuned in to Salam Media with myself, Salailo Makwidire. And joining us right now is going to be Charlotte Kate. Charlotte is coming to us live from Vancouver, Canada. And we'll be chatting a bit about Palestine Prisoners Day, which is a very, very important day, which was commemorated yesterday. Charlotte, welcome to Salam Media and welcome to you. And we're very pleased that you're able to sit out a very, very big time difference and be able to give us your time here in South Africa.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to join you.
First and foremost, Charlotte, Palestine Prisoners Day, for someone that doesn't know what this day is all about and just how important is it for it to be commemorated in a nutshell, how would you explain it?
Well, this year, 2024, is actually the 50th Palestinian Prisoners' Day that's been commemorated. And this day is commemorated every single year because imprisonment has always been one of the weapons that the Zionist regime uses against the Palestinian people. So, what we see consistently over the years, from the 1948 Nakba and the mass expulsion of over 70% of the Palestinian population in order to set up the so called State of Israel to the present day, the Zionist regime has engaged in the mass imprisonment and incarceration of Palestinians, especially targeting political leaders, activists, organizers. People who are organizing students, women, workers, people who are organizing in their communities to defend their land, people who are engaged in resistance really broadly across all kinds of levels, from organizing educational activities to organizing political parties to taking up arms and resisting. So much like the history that we see, for example, in South Africa of people fighting against apartheid, or in Ireland of people fighting colonialism, there's a really long history of political imprisonment of leaders of the struggle. And the same is true in Palestine. So, right now, there are nearly 10,000 Palestinians locked up in Zionist jails and suffering from torture, suffering from ill treatment, suffering from all kinds of abuse, and also serving as imprisoned leaders of the resistance, imprisoned leaders of the freedom struggle. And this day, Palestinian Prisoners' Day, is a day to highlight the struggle of the Palestinian prisoners, their contribution to the leadership of the cause, and to demand their freedom on an international level, both within official bodies like the United Nations, but also through grassroots organizing like educational actions, teach ins, demonstrations in every country around the world.
Mm, mm. Charlotte, with the ongoing genocide right now in Gaza, I think it's very easy to kind of forget that they're prisoners because of the atrocities that the people in Gaza are subjected to. You are involved with the Samidoun Palestine Prison Solidarity Network. I'm sure you've been, in contact with some people that have endured really difficult times in Israeli prisons. Um, what are they saying? What conditions do they find themselves in that we ordinarily wouldn't know about?
Well, absolutely. And this year, Palestinian Prisoners' Day is both very important because of the ongoing genocide, and also very special for the same reason, and particularly important to commemorate. I mean, when we look at the commitment of the Palestinian people and their resistance to liberate the prisoners and to obtain a prisoner exchange from October 7th onward, there's a long history in the Palestinian cause that the only successful way that Palestinian resistance has found to secure the liberation of Palestinian prisoners from Zionist jails is to conduct a prisoner exchange. And so we've seen that consistently over the years, with mass prisoner exchanges taking place in 1985 and 2011 and at other times. Right now, since the 7th of October, as the genocide has been continuing at the hands of the Zionist occupation forces in Gaza, we have seen a simultaneous assault against the Palestinian prisoners in occupation jails. What we're seeing is a tremendous escalation in the use of physical torture and abuse at a very mass level against Palestinians who are being detained. Right now, there's approximately 10,000 Palestinian prisoners inside Zionist jails. There have been around 8,000 arrests that have taken place by the Zionist occupation forces since the 7th of October. But here we're talking about Palestine 1948, called Israel, or the West Bank. In Gaza, there have also been thousands of people who have been rounded up, and they haven't even been put into the Zionist prison system that's usually used. They've created these kind of detention and torture camps where thousands of Palestinians from Gaza have been taken and have been subjected to really the most degrading and cruel forms of treatment. We're seeing numerous cases of women and men who have been sexually assaulted and abused. We've seen and heard numerous cases of Palestinians who have been, forced to strip, have been subjected to various forms of treatment that is designed to humiliate and degrade and to extract forced and false confessions to be used in propaganda against the Palestinian people and their resistance. We've seen the deliberate targeting of healthcare workers, such as doctors and nurses, so that during this genocide, when we've seen occupation forces go after and attack hospitals, what we've seen happen at the same time is the seizure and mass arrest of doctors that won't leave their patients, nurses that won't leave their patients, also going hand in hand with that destruction of hospitals, the confiscation of Palestinian healthcare workers and their detention by the occupation, fundamentally serving as part and parcel of that same assault on the health system. When we saw in November the prisoner exchange that was achieved by the Palestinian resistance to release imprisoned Palestinian children and women. For example, we saw children coming out with their arms in casts because they'd been
mm,
beaten. 15 Palestinian prisoners have died as martyrs since October 7th, including Walid Daqqa, the noted Palestinian thinker, intellectual, and freedom fighter who was systematically denied treatment for his rare bone marrow cancer until he was fundamentally assassinated and left to die in prison by the occupation forces.
I want us to touch a bit on Walid Daqqa, one of the longest serving Palestinian prisoners in Israel. You mentioned that he died of cancer last week. Would you say his life, his struggle kind of encapsulates, what Palestinian people face in Israeli prisons? He's the face of it because of just how harsh he was treated and the conditions that he ultimately succumbed to.
Absolutely. And Walid Daqqa was not only a victim of extreme torture, he was not only a victim of medical mistreatment and abuse and systemic medical neglect. He was an intellectual, he was a revolutionary, and he was a freedom fighter. He was someone who picked up both the pen and the gun to fight for the liberation of Palestine, and who was held in solitary confinement, who, as he was a Palestinian from Baqa al Gharbia. In other words, he had the Israeli citizenship imposed upon him rather than being in the West Bank or Gaza. But he was committed to fighting for the liberation of Palestine and for struggling for a Palestine that was liberated from the river to the sea. And because of that, the Zionist regime refused to release him in consecutive prisoner exchanges and release agreements with the Palestinian resistance. They refused to release him, claiming him at that moment as an Israeli and therefore not subject to these exchanges.
Mm,
He fought for until he and his wife Sanaa were able to obtain the right to marry while he was imprisoned. And then they wanted to have a child. And this was denied to them by the occupation regime. Whereas I should note that Zionist criminal prisoners in all forms are allowed to receive conjugal visits. That's not the case for Palestinian prisoners. And so they use this mechanism of smuggled sperm and fertility clinics that we've actually seen a number of Palestinian prisoners using so that he and Sanaa could give birth to their child, their daughter Milad. And Milad was brought to visit him And Milad has in many ways become a symbol of the children, these children of freedom,
Mm,
who are essentially children who were born in and live in defiance of occupation and the commitment of their parents to see a liberated Palestine. And of course, Walid also left behind novels, theoretical work, writing. His writing on the nature of imprisonment as a mechanism to try to destroy the consciousness of the Palestinian people has been deeply influential on a theoretical level in the Palestinian prisoners movement and in the Palestinian revolutionary movement more broadly, while his creative writing has been dramatized, turned into plays. He's written children's books that are read across the Arab region and around the world. And all of this has shown and kind of exemplified both the extreme mistreatment of the Zionist regime, because he did not just pass away from cancer. He was denied a bone marrow transplant. He was denied early release. He was denied testing for years. He was denied all of the treatments that could have saved his life. And so what happened to Walid Deka is that he was assassinated, like so many Palestinian intellectuals and thinkers and leaders and freedom fighters. He was assassinated by the Zionist regime. But at the same time, he continues to live on as a martyr, and he's left behind not only his child, Milad, who has become a symbol of freedom and commitment to liberation despite the prison walls, but also a rich trove of learning that really is part of the Palestinian liberation movement, but also our international social justice movement.
mm. As South Africans, we really like to draw a lot of comparison to what's currently happening in Palestine to what happened to us here at home. Although it always feels like what the Palestinians are going through is way worse than what we experience here in South Africa. But again, coming into that comparison, during apartheid times here in South Africa, prisons were almost at the center of the regime. They were the beard, all where the likes of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and all the freedom fighters were almost used as examples of the system, that if you don't keep quiet, this is what's going to be happening to you, and you're better off outside oppressed than you are in our prisons. Would you say in the case of Palestine, the Israelis are also using the prison system as a mechanism of perpetuating torture and making sure that people don't rise up, people don't fight, because what's happening in prisons is way worse than what you're experiencing when you're outside?
I mean, one of the things that we've been seeing, I mean, especially with the genocide in Gaza, but also with the construction of the settlements, is this kind of imprisonment of the Palestinian population as a whole through the massive escalation and attacks against the Palestinian people everywhere. And of course, the ongoing genocide, the massive bombing, the siege and blockade on Gaza. I mean, which in and of itself has been going on for 17 years, but has been dramatically escalated. If we look at the struggle of the Palestinian prisoners, right now it's leaders of the Palestinian movement as a whole, who are also the leaders of the Palestinian prisoners movement, who are being sentenced to very long sentences and life sentences inside occupation prisons. People like Marwan Barghouti, Ahmed Sadat, Abdullah Barghouti, Ibrahim Hamid, Nail Barghouti. These are people that we've seen the Zionist regime say that they refuse to release them. They don't want to engage in a prisoner exchange where they release these leaders because they want to use the prisons as a mechanism to suppress Palestinian indigenous resistance. And so we've seen that consistently. The Zionist regime has always used imprisonment as a weapon against the Palestinian people. It has always used torture. It has always used the attempt to just kind of remove these leaders and organizers from their communities in an attempt to blunt the effectiveness of the entire Palestinian freedom movement. But at the same time, what we've seen inside the prisons is that these imprisoned leaders and revolutionaries and strugglers for freedom have essentially turned the dungeons of the occupation into revolutionary schools. You know,
mm,
Palestinian prisoners are children and elders, women and men, teachers and students, workers and farmers. They're people who are by and large part of the popular classes, but come from all walks of life. Nearly every Palestinian family has been touched by imprisonment and incarceration in some way. 40% of Palestinian men in the West Bank and Jerusalem have spent time in Israeli occupation prisons. Everyone has a son, a daughter, a mother, a father, an aunt, an uncle, a cousin who has spent time in Zionist occupation prisons. Imprisonment has become part of the daily fabric of life for Palestinians living under occupation colonialism. And so much like all peoples who have been and are struggling against colonialism, settler colonialism, imperialism, apartheid, and various forms of exploitative and oppressive systems, we very much see that that is the case for the Zionist regime in occupied Palestine.
mm. I remember last week we spoke to one of our analysts and a very, very, staunch supporter of the people of Palestine, Jeff Halper, and he spoke about how Palestinians lack an ANC in them because, of maybe. Something like the prison systems, which was the case with the ANC itself in South Africa, because there was a point where majority of the leaders of the ANC, there was a whole generation that never saw them, that only heard of them, and they took, inspiration, from, they are these people in a remote island somewhere in Cape Town that we have never seen. And, there was a point where the struggle felt like it was being lost because those kind of leaders were nowhere to be seen. They were not heard, and they were, trapped in these prisons. Do you feel that this is also the case in Palestine, where um, they lack their own version of quote unquote the ANC, a revolutionary, movement with one goal, and that all the people believe in, and can rally behind, and the lack thereof has seen the Israeli occupying system kind of have an upper hand, because as you mentioned, all of the people that are supposed to be the leaders of this revolutionary movement of the indigenous people are nowhere to be seen.
Well, I think it's a little bit of a complicated question because, on the one hand, historically, there certainly has been an umbrella organization for the Palestinian people and for the Palestinian Liberation Movement, which was the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. But unfortunately, since 1993, since the Oslo process, since the creation of the so called Palestinian Authority, particularly in the West Bank, what we've unfortunately witnessed is the transformation of the PLO from this meaningful international representative of the Palestinian people and umbrella organization of the Palestinian resistance factions and revolutionary movements into a mechanism that has become kind of subordinate to the Palestinian Authority, and thus tied up in security coordination with the Israeli occupation. But what we do see is that there is a strong sense of unity among the resistance forces and factions in Palestine. And when we look at who is leading the resistance movement today, in many cases, we are speaking about former prisoners, and we're speaking about prisoners who were liberated in many cases through prisoner exchanges. So, for example, Yahya Sinwar, who is one of the most prominent leaders of Hamas in Gaza, is himself a former prisoner who was liberated in an exchange. And that's true for the majority of the resistance leaders today. If we think about, everyone if from Ziad Nakela to Saleh Arori, these are people who were liberated from Zionist occupation jails, often through prisoner exchanges. And there's a deep level of leadership in the Palestinian resistance today, most of which has gone through the Zionist prison system. So, of course,
Mm,
on the one hand, what we see is this systematic attempt to remove the leadership of the resistance and the leadership of the revolutionary movement from Palestinian society through assassination, extrajudicial killing, and imprisonment. But what we also see is the lessons learned from imprisonment being used by the resistance to carry on the fight for the liberation of Palestine. And so the question of, I think, Palestinian political forces are unified in speaking about the fact that there's a need for a collective Palestinian voice. But it's also clear that the Palestinian voice today is represented by all of the broad resistance organizations who right now are very unified, particularly on the ground in Gaza, but really also throughout Palestine and also in exile and diaspora, and confronting this genocide in and fighting Zionism and seeking a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
Mm. No, Charlotte, thank you so much. I think we're going to leave it there. Thank you for giving us your time. And, I hope a lot of more people educate themselves, on the atrocities that are happening in Israeli prisons where Palestinians find themselves in, because the focus is so easy to be distracted. And, you can't blame people for being distracted because of what's currently happening in Gaza and the atrocities there. But they are Palestinians in prison and they're facing really, really, horrific, situations there. So thank you for shedding light on that, and I hope we can catch up with you in a not so distant future. There you have it there. That's Charlotte Cates joining us from Vancouver, Canada. Just giving us insight there about Palestinian Prisoners Day and why it's so important to honor the resilience and to continue with the solidarity with the people of Palestine who are going through a very difficult time, not just outside but also within the confinements of the prisons that they find themselves in, as if they were not in the world's biggest open air prison already. Going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be, shedding an eye back home. We'll be speaking about the KZN and, its political instability, especially as we lead up to the elections. We'll be speaking to political analyst Professor Begim Gomezulu after this.